So let me go. Today's speaker is Ron Saporta, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the University of Toronto, which is to say that he oversees the strategic and operating functions of facilities and services at the university. Ron is a professional engineer with undergraduate and master's degrees in civil engineering from the University of Waterloo, as well as a master's degree in business administration from the Rotman School of Management. Ron joined the University of Toronto in 2018 after having worked for brief periods at Baycrest, St. Michael's Hospital, and Mount Sinai Hospital. Since coming to U of T, he has been named co-chair with John Robinson of the President's Advisory Committee on the Environment, Climate Change, and Sustainability, as well as chair of the Council of Senior Administrative Officers Committee on the Facilities Condition Assessment Program. That's a very impressive title. I've read that title over and over and over, and I'm not quite sure what it means, but it is impressive. So, and Ron is chair of it. So, Ron's primary expertise is in large-scale capital redevelopment, campus operations, and importantly, sustainability programs. His work has earned him recognition and awards from a variety of sources, including Natural Resources of Canada, the Recycling Council of Ontario, the Canadian Healthcare Engineers Society, and the British Medical Journal. I can't imagine too many engineers get awards from the British Medical Journal. So on the University of Toronto's webpage detailing the university's low carbon action plan, Ron is quoted as states that meeting the university's 2030 goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 37% relative to 1990 levels will require the university to, quote, improve power and thermal production, distribute energy more efficiently, and reduce energy consumption, end quote. All of this while the university continues to grow and build new buildings. So this is a tall task, hopefully to be achieved. And today we'll learn how the university and Ron are approaching it. So Ron, I pass it over to you.
Good morning, and thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction and more importantly, the opportunity to come here today and talk about our broader climate positive plan. So I will make a commitment at one point, and I guess the next 40 or so minutes that we have, to talk about Front Campus and what's happening at King's College Circle. But I really think it's important to set the context in terms of why are we doing this? What's the broader strategy behind the big, was it mud pit? I'll call it a mud pit, the big mud pit that we have there on Front Campus. So we'll talk about the climate positive plan. I always like to talk about how we got there, how we developed such an ambitious plan. And then one of the biggest pieces that maybe you take away from our presentation and our opportunity for a discussion today is this concept of balancing carbon and cost. And that so often when institutions, when organizations try to tackle things like net zero, you always end up with this conversation of, well, it's not affordable. Economically, we can't do it. And so I get the luxury of being both an engineer, but also MBA Rotman alum, and have my take on how we've balanced carbon and cost to sort of get to both of them. And then lastly, we'll talk about a couple of other neat projects that you might not be able to see a mud pit today, but hopefully there'll be something in the coming weeks. Right, I'm just going to figure out how to advance here. There we go. So what is the climate positive campus? Well, in about a year and a half ago, we made a commitment as an institution all the way up to governing council to become climate positive by the year 2050. Now, I know since this announcement, a lot has happened. So a lot of scientific papers that say 2050 is too late and all sorts of other things. But for us, what was key and important is that we first, we developed a plan, we published a plan, and now we're starting to talk about how do we actually not just implement, but accelerate the plan. So I'll start off by letting you know that we get the bronze medal in the province, but not the bronze medal that we want. And what I mean by that is that we are the third largest public sector emitter of carbon right across Ontario, across all sectors. In fact, our carbon emissions are so great, it's greater than all colleges put together. It's double any other university. And a lot of that has to do with what we do as an institution, our research intensity that tends to drive carbon up, like a fume hood, for example, uses as much energy as 3 homes, just one fume hood. I can tell you we have thousands of them across our campus. So that drives our carbon emissions up. And even when you start to compare us to the private sector, in fact, we have more carbon emissions. This is going back to 2019 before we launched our strategies than Pearson Airport, more carbon emission than automotive manufacturing. So when you think of higher education, you don't really think of carbon emissions or anything of that nature, but there is a reality that we have that, and we have similar problems than these other industries. And for us, especially for myself and my colleague Mark that I'll introduce later, this is a call to action for us and an understanding of this is a problem that we need to tackle and one that we're committed to as an institution. So that led us to release the low carbon action plan initially, and it's sort of based on this framework that still holds true today. And it's the reality that we produce energy, we distribute energy, and then ultimately we consume energy. And we sort of thought of the process this way and challenged ourselves to say, well, how do we produce as clean as possible? And where we can't, can we do things around carbon capture? Then once we produce that energy, and in fact, we produce it just 3 doors down at our central utility plant, how do we distribute it to the over 200 buildings that we have on campus and do that distribution as efficient as possible? Anything you lose in that process is just pure waste. And then lastly, although one would argue most importantly, how do you actually reduce the consumption itself? And with this framework in mind, we came up with 4 different principles. And the first principle is a reduction first principle, and it's just quite simply cleanest and cheapest energy is the one that we don't consume. So how do we reduce our consumption on campus and hence then take that all the way up that sort of framework or value chain I presented to reduce our emissions on the production side? Secondly, is this idea of balancing carbon versus cost. And I'll dive into this a bit more detail, but just to sort of kick it off, there's a realization that in Ontario, and this is data from the last 12 months, electricity is about 5 times cleaner than natural gas on an equivalent energy basis. And you can kind of see the sort of carbon intensity per equivalent kilowatt hour for electricity and natural gas. But that same unit of energy is about 10 times more expensive in electricity than natural gas. You have this reverse incentive. Electricity is 5 times cleaner. And in fact, if we just flip that on its head, we can make an 80% reduction if we electrified everything. At the same time, 10 times more expensive, that would be an impact to the institution of over $180 million a year. Not financially achievable. So we end up with this challenge of how do you balance these two things? And I don't position this as an excuse. This isn't a reason why you don't do it. This is just a factor that we need to overcome in the design of our solutions. The other interesting part about the university, I call it reaching beyond our own assets. About 15% of the energy and hence the emissions that we have are related to assets that are not ours. So these are things like the ROM, we provide all of the energy there. 700 University is an office building at a college university. We sell energy in that space. So a lot of the challenges that we face are very similar to municipalities. We need to incentivize behavior change in areas that are not our own to reduce our own emissions. And the last principle that we focus on, and what I actually think differentiates us, arguably differentiates all of higher education from industry, is the opportunity to foster innovative solutions. And to me, that means 2 different things. First, it means how do we effectively partner with our academic colleagues? How do we effectively partner with our students to co-design or even develop some of these solutions and innovations internally? We have world-class researchers, we have world-class students. There's an abundance of knowledge there that we can utilize to achieve these goals. The other piece is that we can partner with industry. We have a couple of partnerships right now where industry is coming forward, working with our own faculty members, working with our facilities groups to implement innovations at a local level and try out new technologies, things that are not necessarily commercialized yet, but that can help us get to that future. So that's the principles, and we sort of launched the development of our plan based on these principles. And this is a roadmap we put together that describes about 18 months worth of work, about 50 or 60 individuals across the institution, where we partnered with an external firm on the engineering side to help us run some of the analysis. And I think I've summarized it in 3 slides and maybe the next 5 minutes. So my apologies to those 50 people that did a year and a half worth of work. It's phenomenal. And it came to where we are today. And in essence, we start off with figuring out those principles and then starting to look at what are our existing conditions? We have a massive infrastructure system. I'll show you some photos in a moment. And we started to then say, based on that, what concepts can we develop to get to this climate positive future? And then we started to look at what are future loads, meaning as we build new buildings, we'll need more energy. So how do we then also not just meet our current needs, but meet those future needs? And we came up with multiple different strategies. And we started running them through different gates to finally get to what we selected. And so the three front runners that we studied in great detail are one, what we call central generation. It's what we have today, a central plant there in the red on the left. And then that distributes to the 200 buildings. We came up with what we called a nodal generation strategy. So we've got such a massive campus. Does it make sense to do it all in one place, or can we be more efficient if we do it in 4 places? Or do we just abandon the idea of district energy? Does it make sense in the future to just have every building stand on its own? Now, we used a multi-factor evaluation matrix for this. We looked at the environmental impacts, primarily focused on carbon in this case, but also looking at implementation and aspects of the environmental impact, digging up roads, things of that nature. Resiliency was a key component for us. And you'll hear me talk about this in a bit more detail in the coming slides, but when you have climate change that we're experiencing, we recognize the fact that that's likely to lead to more adverse climate events. So what components of our infrastructure do we need to increase resiliency so that we can maintain the operations, or at the very least maintain the critical components of our operations? People who live on our campus, the research that needs that energy to be constant, and so on. Operations is a key element for us here. So we need to make sure we can come up with some amazing designs, but if building operators can't operate it, it's not going to work. So we needed to make sure that it was also feasible for our workforce and the operations component. We partnered with some faculty to start to look at what are the social aspects of what we're trying to achieve. And you can see here, it wasn't a huge differentiator. In fact, this was one of the biggest debates that we ended up scoring all three of them the same, that the opportunity for that human impact, the social interaction was the same. It was difficult to differentiate in this case. And then lastly is economics. You can't do this type of analysis without understanding your capital expenses and operating expenses. And you can see we went with alternative number 1, and that was that internodal strategy. And in essence, it brings us to this graph. We started to then say, if that's our strategy, what do our carbon projections look like moving forward? And our target initially was to be net zero. And then we were challenged by a couple of our team members to simply say, hold on, if you can get to net zero, what if you just add 1 more solar panel? What happens then? Well, now all of a sudden you're into negative carbon. Or if we're gonna add 1, why not 100? Right? Why not even more than that? And we started then to talk about this idea of a net negative campus. And we thought that that was really important because the campus strategy only speaks to the energy that we consume in the buildings, right? So that's traditionally called scope 1 and scope 2 carbon, if you know the different scopes. What's emitted from this concept is the idea of scope 3, that's indirect emissions. That's things like air travel, the emissions associated with what we produce, the goods and services that we procure as an institution. So we played around with this concept. If we can make our campus negative, could that be a carbon sink that accounts for all of the air travel that we need to do to disseminate the knowledge that we create? Or can we use that negative carbon to offset the goods and services that we need to procure, once again, to do the great academic work that we do? And so I'm an optimist. I didn't want to publish a strategy that says we're going to be net negative. That just sounds awful. So we flipped it on its head and we said we're going to be climate positive. And this is what climate positive means to us. We also said climate positive campus, because if there's any feedback that we receive, and I always welcome it to make the plan better, is that it is by nature only focused on scope 1 and scope 2, only on the energy that we consume. It doesn't include air travel as of yet. Behind the scenes, we're working on a climate positive institutional plan, but we didn't want to wait to release this until we were able to figure that out. So we're doing it stepwise because, there's sort of a call to action and we need to start taking action today. So there's another reality to all of this, is that we have huge ambitions as an institution. And if you go to our master plan, you can see that we're calling for a near doubling of square footage of our buildings on this campus, primarily by increased density. And what I want to point out about our plan from a climate positive perspective is that it is not a carbon intensity plan. A lot of people talk about it. I think they call it donut economics, if I remember correctly, where you look at intensities, right? So if I increase my square footage, keep my emissions the same, I'm less carbon intensive, like carbon per square foot. That's not what we're talking about. We are talking about absolute carbon. We're going to reduce absolute carbon while we double the size of campus. That's another huge factor, really tough to sort of contemplate. The other piece is the reality that we have, and I think my head's in the way for you to see some of these pipes in the room, but we have one of the oldest and largest district energy system in the country. It's about 120 years old. For district energy fans, it was actually put in as a DC electric distribution system, not even the AC power we have today. So there's been a lot of modernization and conversions of it. But we realize that district energy allows us to share energy between buildings and allows us to reduce carbon as a result. So we think that it's an important part of the strategy, and we need to then renew this 120-year-old infrastructure. And that's partly what's happening at King's College Circle, but not the entire story. So at the end of the day, it boils down to these three goals. First of which is the responsible management of our growth. And we've got tactics underneath each one of these I'll share with you. Second of which is renewing our aged utility infrastructure. Thank you. And the last is a concept around making sure that we have a resilient strategy. So on the growth, what we did, I want to say 2 summers ago, is we implemented a policy of the institution where we now have an energy and a carbon budget per project. So when a project goes through our governance for approval, they get approval financially. There's also an approval for how much energy they're allowed to use as a firm cap and how much carbon they're allowed to generate as a firm cap. That helps us from a carbon accounting perspective. So now we can project forward what buildings are coming, how much energy they're going to use. That helps our utilities folks to make sure we have power there, and how much carbon they're going to consume. And that helps us make sure that graph is correct. And that's a firm cap, and every project that's been approved since that policy came in has meant that. And so now when we say things are on budget, that means they're on budget financially, but also on budget from a carbon perspective. Our intent is to also extend our district energy system to all of our buildings. This will allow us to do that energy sharing, and then start to introduce more use both on campus and off campus of renewable energy. The image here, this is a Spadina Sussex residence that's being built about a block north from here. That's going to be one of our lowest carbon residences, primarily because it's being fed by geo-exchange system that's directly to the west of it. So similar to what's happening at King's College Circle, there's another geo-exchange system there that's going to heat and cool this building. On the infrastructure side, the biggest push here is to eliminate fossil fuels as our heating source. Right, so we talked about balancing carbon versus cost. Why would we do this from a carbon perspective is quite obvious. It's 5 times cleaner to electrify. How we afford to do it, I'll get to in the coming slides. And the other thing we want to do is to eliminate steam. Now, this is something that we're actively studying to see, does this make sense? And when we released the plan about 1.5 years ago, we were quite confident moving from steam to hot water is in essence an energy source that's less carbon intensive. There are other challenges with it that are being explored, but ultimately, we're trying to eliminate fossil fuels and move that distribution to be as efficient as possible. And most importantly, and this really, I don't know if people remember the water buyback program and that the city of Toronto did in the 1990s. This is something that I remember because it's my field, but in essence, we had a housing boom in Toronto. We didn't have enough water plants. So the city said, we'll give you $75 for every person who changes a toilet to a low flush toilet. And they were basically buying water capacity back. So we didn't have to build new water treatment plants. We can just reduce demand and then use that demand to fund new housing or to provide water to new housing. So we're implementing a very similar concept. We're going to double the size of campus. I can double the central utility plant. That obviously has knockoff impacts to our carbon. Or we can reduce demand in all of our existing buildings and use that capacity to service our new buildings. And that's how we can do an absolute plan where we don't necessarily need to double our carbon emissions as a result. So that last point is just a more succinct way of saying that we're going to do deep energy retrofits to reduce that demand so we can then take that excess capacity it generates to support new buildings. And the last concept here has to do with resiliency. And just I always like to illustrate this example because I'm talking about eliminating fossil fuels, and in where we are in the city, that means electrification. So we're going to put in electric heating sources. You can also imagine in downtown core, where Toronto Hydro has probably its oldest assets, we experience quite a few blackouts. And so my nightmare situation is, February on a Saturday at 2 a.m., because it always happens Saturday at 2 a.m. We have a blackout, and that we're relying on that electricity to heat the buildings that is servicing our research, our students and residents, Vivarium, CL3 labs, all these critical assets you can imagine. In the situation, the outcomes can be quite disastrous. So we're working with Toronto Hydro to actually diversify the electrical feeds that are coming in. Today, we have one feed that does 80% of our campus. Our plan looks to bring in 3 feeds from 3 different substations. And we're so fortunate that we are in a part of the city where if you just go 1 block east, it's a different feed from Hydro 1, what used to be Ontario Hydro, that comes in from the east of the city. And the other feed comes in from the west. So we are diversifying that electrical input, not just at the Toronto Hydro level, but at the Hydro 1 level. So that gives us a bit more confidence in the resiliency of the system, and that hopefully we can then maintain the critical assets. The other components, which we're trying to illustrate in this image up here, is that they're interconnected. So if we do lose one, we can take power from the other feed and keep the critical assets up and running. And that's how we've tackled resiliency in this regard. So this is where I pause and talk about King's College Circle, because I think King's College Circle and what's happening there exemplifies all of these goals. So it's a big mud pit. What's happening below the mud pit is that we put in 372 wells. See, 74. I always get the 4 and the 2 confused. And I'm over 370. That's why I always write over. Can't be wrong. They're about 250 meters deep. I always like to liken it there to. Oh, you can't see that. How do I get rid of this pop-up? It's about a half a CN tower below ground. I always emphasize that these are closed loop systems. We're not pulling water from the ground, and we're not putting water in the ground. It is a closed loop system that in essence uses the bedrock as a thermal battery. So we take the excess heat we have in the summer, it's in essence our air conditioning systems. Instead of rejecting that heat to the atmosphere, we pull that and we put it in these closed loop systems. The water goes down warm, the bedrock cools it. What it's actually doing is absorbing that heat in the rock. Comes up cold, we can use that to cool our buildings. And then we flip the cycle in the winter. So we put the cold water down and it takes the heat back out of that rock. So you're basically, imagine a battery, but we're storing heat instead of storing electricity. That's how that system works. But what's really unique about this is that we're doing this in the heart of our historic core. So for us, this is a demonstration project, not just for the institution. In fact, we've shown this to the city. I've been to the mayor's office a few times to talk about the Greenville Challenge, also share this with other landlords and institutional property owners across the country, because we believe if we can do this in the oldest part of the university, that you can do this to any building. Right? So net zero and renewable energies is not just about the brand new buildings. It's also what do we do with our historic building stock? And this is our answer to that. But what I always love to point out is number 3. And you can't see it because my face is in the way if you're in the room. Is there a way to move that for a moment? Oh, okay, I'll put me down here. We're actually building what I call a subterranean classroom. So we're also building a teaching and learning aid here, such that we can hold lectures of up to 20 people below ground. And this way our engineering professors, so actually a course in Rotman that is interested in seeing this, open to any faculty, to go down and physically see how geoexchange system works. So it's not just how does it work in a textbook, they'll be able to go and see it. We had a fun meeting a few weeks back where we chose the colors. We're going to color code everything so it's really clear. We have a partnership with the museum, with ROM. You can see how there's some windows here. And when you go to that parking lot and you come back out, you're going to walk right by this system. It's going to have big glass windows and an informational display to actually start to inform the public. What are we doing here? How does this type of system work? And how can we incorporate this into various different other spaces? So to me, this sort of hits everything. It's a renewable energy project. It's diversifying our fuel sources from a resiliency perspective. And most importantly, it's a big learning aid. Because if we can take this and educate our students, hopefully they take those concepts and they take it right, out of the university, out of the city, hopefully even beyond. So that's our intent. I'll gladly at the end to answer any further questions on this one. I think the other big one that you mentioned that I'll just throw out there, we are gunning for September 2023. So at the beginning of the next academic term, we hope to finish all of the landscaping above grade. So how does this all add up? I mentioned these strategies, but when you start to look at it, that dotted gray line at the top, well, red line is our business as usual. If we double the size of campus and build everything energy efficient, that's where we would be. But as we start to overlay our carbon budget, our renewable energy sources, our deep energy retrofits, you can see how that strategy starts to go down. And lastly, the green section is the renewable energy piece. And how do we become negative? And just to highlight that for a moment, we've made a very explicit target. So we didn't want to give ourselves an excuse that says, let's just go put a whole bunch of solar panels everywhere and do nothing to our emissions. We said that we will cut our emissions in an absolute measure by 80% no matter what. That last part, our intention is to generate more than that last 20% of energy we consume, such that we can make it negative. And that's what that bar chart's trying to demonstrate. And just to show you, bear in mind, the university actually has quite a lot of land holdings, not just our 3 campuses, but right across the province. And our intent is to leverage these land holdings. So we're now in the middle of a feasibility study for large scale solar, 20, 30 megawatts total. That's, I can't even think of an example of what that would be. That would do the whole campus, I guess, for Peaks 22, but it's large scale. We have the Koffler Scientific Reserve, which is up just in around Newmarket, King City space. That area, not only is it a huge land holding, it's grass and certain sections are underutilized, it also creates a lab. We have a lot of faculty members that are studying renewable energy. They would love for us to have this type of asset that they can go and do research on. Professor Cynthia Go, for example, in chemistry, we're partnering with her right now. She has a coating that she thinks if you put on existing solar panels, you can actually increase the output of the solar panel just by spraying on a coating, right? So this would be perfect for her. She could use this as a research lab, and I imagine it's almost like if you build it, they will come. There's probably at least 20 or 30 other faculty members that could use this as a research lab. So making electrification work. This, I promise I would talk about this. This is, let's say, that intersection between engineering and finance. How do you reconcile the fact that it's 5 times cleaner, 10 times more expensive? And to do that, I'm going to do a small deep dive into electricity markets in Ontario. Just 2 slides. Hopefully I do a good job at breaking it down. Oops, I thought another slide was coming up next. What I will say on this one is that this is the boiler that we're talking about changing, boiler number 1. These boilers, if you've seen a natural gas boiler of this size, it's about the size of this building. It's 3 buildings down, 3 stories tall, I don't know, like 20 meters by 20 meters by a couple of 100 meters. These are big boilers, not the type that you would have in a home by any means. And they were all of our boilers. We have 4 of them. They were installed in the 1950s and 1960s. So they're well beyond useful life. And we need to do something from a deferred maintenance perspective. We need to replace these boilers. So this is the time for us to make a decision. Do we put in a natural gas boiler that'll last another 30 years, or do we figure out how to balance carbon with cost and take action now? And that's our intent. So I said it's 10 times more expensive. What's really important to keep in mind in electricity is there's 3 pieces. And I want to just emphasize this is the industrial market. So this is not how residential rates work. This isn't what you would see at home, but it's you would see at large consumers like ourselves, where you have 3 components. You've got something that's called global adjustment. That's the sort of darkish top area. I should have done a better job differentiating the colors. Then there's regulatory distribution charges. And then lastly, there's something that we call HOPE, but don't be too optimistic. It stands for the Hourly Ontario Electricity Price. It's not often full of hope. In fact, it's going up and down on a daily basis. Those are the components of electricity. Natural gas, it's an open market, it's commodity traded. We have hedging strategies, a very sort of traditional sort of market. And you could see the difference here in those 2 pieces. But there's 2 ways that you can buy electricity in Ontario, in the industrial markets. And it really has to do with that top section, not the hope that is pseudo market traded, but the rest of it, you can purchase it either based on your peak demand, or you can purchase it on your total consumption. And if you look at it from a peak demand perspective, so that is, what is the most that you use in that peak day? They take that peak and they figure out this regulatory charge and global adjustment charge. And how much you consume the rest of the year is not relevant to them. You know, the alternative is they look at everything that you consume and they calculate your costs in that way. And I think here's the graph I was looking at. So this is our profile on a daily basis for our campus. We peak in the summer because of air conditioning. We use a lot of electricity because of air conditioning. So you could see that if we look at it from a demand perspective, that is the highest point there, usually happens July, August. It's sort of like the what's my peak versus the consumption is the area under the curve. So if we focus strictly on the peak, and if you keep your peak the same, I'll go back one slide, everything that I pointed out there in those brackets becomes a fixed cost. Your incremental consumption is only that little hope piece. That's 20 cents compared to natural gas at 17 cents. So it's near parity. So if we can keep our peak fixed, we can actually buy electricity at almost the same price of gas. What that means is that this whole thing hatched in red is opportunity for us to use electricity to heat the buildings without changing our peak. So long as we don't exceed that summer peak, and I'm oversimplifying, there's more nuances to that, but as long as we don't exceed that summer peak, we could actually use all this electricity and it's almost at parity with gas. But then there's a couple of little tricks that we have up our sleeves. And what we can start to do is say, hold on, what if we actually reduce our peak? And we can reduce our peak by doing things like LED lighting. It's probably one of the easiest. An LED light bulb uses less electricity. We probably have, I can't even fathom, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 million light bulbs. We change all of that, that'll reduce our peak. We can do some neat tricks to do with gas turbines and supercooling your air. And that I think is a whole different conversation with a mechanical engineer, not a civil engineer, but it's feasible. And the other thing that we can do is energy storage, where we can fill things like batteries off peak and then discharge them to reduce your peak. And if you did that quite graphically, you could actually reduce that line and lower it. And if I reduce my peak demand, now all of a sudden I can take all of that red space, all of that gray space, and I can use that to generate heating and cooling and not have to increase our utility bills. And so this is how we've contemplated balancing carbon and cost at our first phase. And it brings us to our first step in the plan that we call Project Leap. And so this is what I hope will be the mud pile next week that you can see. And this is orders of magnitude different than what we're talking about at King's College Circle. King's College Circle, when that system is up and running, is going to offset about 15,000 tons of carbon a year. Our base on this campus is about 100,000, so easy math, 15%. What we're talking about with Project Leap is one project that reduces our emissions by over 50%. So just to cut it in half by about 46,000 metric tons, and see my math is a bit off there on the 90 and 100, but nonetheless, it starts our transition away from fossil fuels. And ultimately, based on that strategy I just shown, we should be net zero at the utility budget perspective. We're still going to be exposed to market on the hub. We'll still be exposed to market pricing on gas, but conceptually, it's the same. Where we end up with some savings to pay back a project of this nature is through carbon tax for savings. We're exposed to the carbon market just like anyone else. And you know that future rate of $150 per ton, if we're going to save about 46,000 tons, you can do the math, about $9 million of tax savings. That's a huge incentive for the economists in the room. You would argue, hey, carbon tax is doing its job. The university is going to do this project because I can use that $9 million to start to pay the financing for such a project. And lastly, it helps us to mitigate some deferred maintenance risk. That boiler's from 1950. I need to do something. So why not do something that is aligned with our climate ambitions, eliminates deferred maintenance risks, and has a payback with respect to carbon tax. This project, just by, I'll jump into this slide. So why do we call it Project Leap? We actually called it Project 50 initially, because it was 50%. And that's all because we wanted everyone to focus, all of our engineers on staff focus on 50%, 50%. And then someone told us, the marketing people won't like that. You need a better name. So we talked about this and we came up with Project LEAP. It's an acronym, but I actually think, it comes out of figuratively is far better than the acronym. The acronym is Low Emissions Accelerator Program. But for us, it's a leap in what we're trying to achieve, because this concept that the team came up with actually gets us to our 2035 targets about a decade earlier. So it is quite literally a leap forward. And you could see that here. If we did this project and nothing else, everything shown there in orange or yellow is our incremental avoided carbon. We actually hit that target 10 years in advance, and we avoid, I think it's almost half a million tons of carbon in total. That doesn't mean we're going to stop. I actually hope that the slope of that line stays the same and we hit zero or negative well advanced at 2050, but this is our starting point. This project does a couple of things, and it builds on, we had the concept of the climate positive plan. Now it's actually getting into the nuts and bolts of the reality of it. So we have energy storage, we have renewed feeds coming in. We're doing all sorts of things, especially around innovation and how do we start to involve our faculty? How do we start to involve our student body into these type of projects? One side note that I always like to flag is that working with Professor Mary Anatucci to measure not just the economic outcomes and the environmental outcomes of these building retrofits, but how do we also monitor the well-being outcomes of the people in the building? Right, so you can, extreme example, I'll just turn off the energy to the building. I'll have the best, zero carbon, zero utilities, everyone's great, but everyone's wearing parkas all winter long because there's no heating. So how do we make sure we don't do anything that adversely impacts the occupants and their well-being? And those are sort of takeoffs that we're looking to do. Scope itself, I can gladly talk to this in great detail, but it's in essence a deep energy retrofit, going into a space, doing lighting, doing heat recovery, and ultimately asking ourselves, how do we reduce what's listed here as EUI, that's the energy use intensity? How do we take the energy in that space, normalize to square footage, and reduce it by 40% from where we are today? And that's that concept of, in essence, buying back the demand. That's 40% that we could use for the next building without increasing. Same thing for what we call the low carbon node. The only thing I'd add in this space is that our district energy system doesn't actually go south of College, but we have a lot of buildings south of College. So we currently get energy in these spaces from a third party. From Enwave, if you've heard of them, it's a big private entity that creates steam and so on. And we're looking to exit that and do it ourselves so we could be more accountable and responsible to our emissions versus an entity that is more sort of bottom line focused. So there is quite a lot of work happening financially. I don't know if I have it in the slide deck, but you may have seen an announcement a few months back that we are partnering with the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. So they're providing us about $55 million in financing to make this happen. And we're also looking for a slew of grants. But I think what that does is that helps us get over the hump of the business case, right? Like I think 8 to 10 year payback in rough terms is a really good target. This project is a little bit beyond that, but some incentives that we've been developing get us into that sweet spot where we're quite confident we can get approval from both our governing council and the other powers that be. I jumped the gun on this one. So that we're quite proud to be partners with CIB. In fact, we're the first public sector partner that they have. And now we're trying to work with them to see how this type of interesting financial models could be shared with other entities. Other public sector entities could be universities, hospitals, colleges, to really spur on this type of low carbon economy. So this is where I said I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and I did that twofold. I know it was sort of a last minute change to the lineup. That's the extent of my sports analogies, but I wanted to emphasize that this type of work doesn't happen with one individual. It happens with a team. I think we've got about 20 or 30 people focused solely on this, and Mark is our director of energy and sustainability. He's a mechanical engineer, so he could tell you more about those heat pumps than I can, but he also joined us about 2 years ago. from the private sector, where he did these type of energy projects right across North America, and sort of brings a really interesting take to us here. And I'll turn it over to Mark. We got about, I think, 10 minutes. I'm going to make sure we're on time for questions and so on. And what we wanted to just end off with was a conversation about, I talked about the plan and I talked about infrastructure, but there's the reality is there's probably only 10 people in the institution who can influence and touch that infrastructure. And if we're really going to be a climate positive institution, we need to start talking about what does the entire institution need to do? What do our faculty member, our staff, our students, what type of changes do we want to see across the campus to fulfill this vision? So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark to talk to us about the Sustainable Change Program.
Thank you, Ron. Pleasure to be here this morning. And I'll start by just adding one little thing that he would kick me under the table if I said this, but most recently, Ron, our COO, has been named to Canada's Clean 16. So he was given an award last week as part of the Canada Clean 50. And out of the Clean 50, he was distinguished as being the Clean 16, so top 16. So congratulations, Ron. So a little bit of background here on the Sustainable Change programs. We was an opportunity here. We had a Green Suite engagement program, and it covered a few of the bases, but we wanted to expand it, revitalize it, and improve it a little bit. So we wanted to see how we can connect, engage, and empower the U of T community, and kind of move beyond the traditional sort of Green Suite to more of a holistic sustainability approach, and also have it guided by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We really wanted to research what is in the market, what other institutions are doing, and do a bit of a scan to ensure that what we're going to launch is really a best-in-class suite of engagement programs. We also did a lot of engagement internally within the U of T to get feedback. So we hosted a number of sessions, and we had over 40 participants that provided feedback on our programs from a diverse range of programs and faculties. So our new program that we're launching is online. It is quite efficient, and it's highly automated compared to what some of our peer institutions are doing. And if I step back for a second, maybe tie a parallel here to what Ron was talking about earlier in terms of framework. If you recall, he was talking about framework for our low carbon action plan, where we talk about how we produce, distribute, and then also consume energy. The fourth one after that are the behaviors that drive that whole sort of distribution chain. So I like to view it as sort of a pyramid. So at the top, you got your produce, and you get down to the distribution, and you get down to the consumption. But then that bottom layer is really the people that interact with these systems, and they're the ones that actually drive the consumption. So it's important to have a top-down strategy where you tackle the distribution, you tackle the supply, you tackle the building efficiency, but it's really important as well to also engage the occupants and to tackle how the behaviors we deploy towards energy consumption and sustainability. So the programs we have here are to engage and ultimately empower our campus community members. Our campus, we refer to it often as a city within a city. We have between 100 and 120,000 people within this community on campus. So we're trying to drive behavior within, staff, students, and faculty. And this is a very large community that's interacting with our massive district energy system. We want to encourage behavior change. We want to foster friendly competition. And we also want to create a culture shift towards sustainable practices. And lastly, we also want accountability from our campus users. So we have taken our previous Green Suite and expanded it from 3 programs to 5. So the programs that we've launched this year are a Sustainable Labs program, Sustainable Offices, Sustainable Events, Sustainable Residences, as well as Sustainable Courses. If we take a quick look at Sustainable Labs, who can certify? So any lab or research group or individual can now certify their lab online as being a certified green lab. And what we're focusing on here within this certification program is really about energy consumption, water consumption, waste production, chemical procurement, as well as the habits and the culture within how they operate the different labs and research areas. If we look at sustainable offices, again, here, this is anyone who has an office or works on campus. You know, an individual can certify their workspace. A team can certify their environment. A whole division can certify their building or their floor, let's say, or a whole department. So for example, through FNS, Facilities and Services, we've launched a target to certify the whole fourth floor of the 255 McCall, sort of the exam center where our offices are headquartered. So we're looking to have the whole floor certified as a certified green office. And this program covers, again, you know, energy consumption, waste production, the way meetings are hosted, the food that is being used and the organics that are being disposed of, the transportation, as well as procurement of office supplies, and lastly, but most importantly, the culture. If we go over to sustainable residences, this is really about sustainable living. And, you know, we host a lot of students and residents on campus. I think this is a great way where we can affect change and create sustainable behaviors with these students, you know, as they're incubated, if you will, on our campus before they leave and go hopefully purchase homes. That's become a little bit harder in the GTA, but we're looking for them here to certify their individual room, to do a whole unit, or maybe the Dawn and residents can certify a whole floor or the whole residence building. And this again covers energy consumption, it covers water consumption, waste that's produced, transportation, and most importantly here, it's a lifestyle. You know, we're not teaching in higher education students how to get a job. We're teaching them really how to live, right? And how to go on and be leaders in our society. Another one here is sustainable events. So the events that we host on campus, whether it's convocation or whether it's anything else, there's choices that have to be made on how the event is hosted and how it's managed, from perhaps catering or how the waste is disposed of, what types of disposable cups or cutlery are used and how that's treated. So any event on campus can now get certified as a sustainable event. And this covers the setup, the food, the waste, and how it's closed. So we've had a number of events in the last 6 months that have been certified, including a lot of events during orientation week, which was very encouraging. Another one here is sustainable courses. So courses in any discipline or subject can now become certified courses. What we look is for them to, at minimum, have a presentation during one of the first sort of introductory classes for 5 or 10 minutes that talks about sustainability and how the course is going to be sustainable in terms of minimizing paper usage and sort of the general practices of how the course is delivered. And this covers, you know, the course materials, the delivery, as well as the engagement throughout the session. So here is our sort of ranking, I guess, if you will, and this is what spurs a little bit of that friendly competition. So we have 4 different levels. You can see bronze, silver, gold, and at the top is platinum. And this is based on the points that are accumulated through the online questionnaire that we've developed. So the process here is to go online to the Sustainability Office website and to click on the section and describe if you're applying as an individual or certifying an event or a residence, a private residence, or a whole floor. So check off the category and then to fill out the questionnaire and then to submit and have it reviewed and certified by a member of my team in the Sustainability Office that will then deliver sort of the certification. Thank you very much.